Well, that gives you the broad
Yes,
outline.
yes, thank
I don't
you
know what
very
else you need
Thank you very much.
from that.
Well, there may revisit it.
Yeah, I'm sure there are pieces of it that need to be
For
written.
example, I'm curious about Schwab. If you had any,
I never had any contact with Schwab.
what you reference him briefly in a piece or two. Part of my question has to do with the work that my friend Alan Block has done on Schwab, which uncovers his involvement in the Jewish.
Yes, and I didn't know Schwab. Was very involved in Jewish education and very important, but I didn't know him I never knew him personally. And you know, Mike made did you read Mike's little article on the fly in the fly bottle?
I'm not sure I have.
You should look it up.
Yeah.
It's a really good essay on my influence on Mike.
Oh, well. Do you have that reference?
No, I do not.
Well, let's.
It's a really
David Smith. Yeah.
it's a really good article. The mistake he makes is he assumed that I worked with Schwab when I was at the University of Chicago.
That's a big mistake.
Yeah, and I don't know how Mike ever got that idea. I have no idea.
Really?
He
You
just
certainly wouldn't put it together intellectually.
no. And I didn't know Schwab.
Was he there at the time?
Yes, but he was teaching in biology.
Yeah, of course. Yes, of course.
And I had no contact with him as far as I know. I didn't take any sciences in Chicago because I passed all of Hutchins' exams except in the social sciences and the humanities. I did all the biological sciences and the physical sciences and the math area with flying colors, and I had to do some so-called undergrad courses in the humanities and social sciences.
How did that work that you were admitted to the graduate school there
Well,
without your BA? Yes, right.
because of Hutchins.
Because of Hutchins.
You know, Hutchins, one of the things that he did was to do away with essentially, you try to do away with the BA, in that the educational program there was developed to bring in juniors and seniors in high school if they could, not necessarily. And he asked then Ralph Tyler, who was the university examiner, to develop proficiency exams in the major academic fields. And so people applying for work at Chicago could have basic course loads changed if they passed the entrance exams. And I, with my background, and I never had any work in biological sciences, but I passed the biological exam without any trouble. And they did not offer a BA because I was admitted with 2 years of undergraduate work, plus my 15 months in A&M. I had enough credit, and I had enough credit to be admitted, and they did not offer the BA, and I moved directly to the master's degree. Yeah. No.
Where did you discover MacMurray?
Well, this is again going back to the way in which Amazon is destroying the intellectual life. I'm sure I picked up MacMurray in one of those bookstores.
Oh.
I mean, his 2 volumes on self as agent and persons in relation were very, very useful for me, extremely useful, and they're really good work. As well as his other work, which I don't remember by name at the present time, because he was one of the few people who managed to bring together both existentialism and analytic philosophy, as well as being somewhat sympathetic to a Marxian socialist orientation. And he's a really important figure that I don't think has been recognized adequately within the intellectual world.
It shows up in your work.
Yeah, I know. A very moving figure, yeah. And almost all of the stuff that I picked up by independent reading. I'm picked up by independent reading and by browsing bookstores. Well, all of my last year at Wisconsin, I spent primarily in the library, also browsing shelves in the library.
I always check out the new book list at LSU.
Yeah, no, I used to do that too. Yeah, yeah.
But doing your work on Dwayne's work, one way, as you're well aware, is to follow up on his sources, like MacMurray, and to read, if you choose.
Had you read MacMurray? Have you read MacMurray?
Not, no.
Well, you haven't.
I did not. I did a bibliography. I compiled all your notes.
It's quite an extensive, yeah.
And so you referenced him quite a lot and throughout a diverse section. I mean, from chapter 2 on 24, which is a huge time period. So I just
Yeah, no. And I don't know too many other people who've used him, which is really sad. He becomes the appropriate critique of Piaget's work, because Piaget begins his investigation of child cognitive functioning after the language is already developed. And MacMurray recognizes that a person is a person the moment they are in a family situation. And therefore, and this is now, proving the case in terms of the research that's being done on children and language. The New Yorker has a really great article, incidentally, on the most recent New Yorker, on the program in Providence, Rhode Island, on working with people in 3 different socioeconomic groups in terms of language development in the family, starting with infancy on up, and the importance of conversation in the family. And, I was pushing conversation back in that first thing I did on, when was it, on new modes of man's relationship to man, and that miserable title, but focusing very much on conversation, which comes out not of MacMurray so much as out of Buber in some ways.
The eyeball. Yeah. The imprinting character of early infancy, and particularly the symbiotic relation to the significant caretaker, is also been explored extensively psychoanalytically.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of work being. And one of the doctoral students I had, this must have been in the mid-60s. It was the mid to upper 60s. Did her dissertation on language development and talking about language nurses that would go into homes helping mothers and parents attend to the language that they were using with kids. So I've been aware of that area for a long, long time.
There was a piece in the New York Times recently about reading comprehension and the importance of reading aloud and oral reading.
Yeah, well, that's also true in the New Yorker.
In the relationship
Right.
with the parent.
Yeah. Do you need a walk? Is that...
I just need to stand up if it's all right.
No, that's fine.
Yeah.
What time is it? I lost track of time.
It's at 12:42.
Why don't we take a break and
Yeah.
stop this for a while?
Right, but does your daughter's involvement in that church, is it a kind of is it a kind of create a gap at all?
Well, her husband was ordained within this particular church by another pastor in New Haven. And so he tried, not successfully, when they were in Guilford, Connecticut, he tried to establish a center for youth after school. He had sort of a restaurant hangout kind of thing, where the kids would gather and, they could eat and drink milkshakes and things of that kind. He didn't get enough financial support, so it fell through. And he then whereas he has been ordained within this denomination, if you can call it a denomination. He himself is a real estate appraiser.
Okay.
So my daughter has been involved in some of the teaching in this with this dance group, and is involved in the church community. But yeah. But I know no longer when I visit them. Ellen and I go to a local Episcopal church in that area.
Yeah.
As we were sitting in the service one day before we made decisions about what to do, and Ellen always takes her Hebrew Bible and her Greek New Testament in order to follow the lessons, and she was listening, and she opened up her her Hebrew Bible and started to read, which meant that she was no longer paying attention. And I sat there thinking, geez, what the hell is going on in their minds? Why are they doing that? Kind of anthropologically. And then when he started to make cracks, unthinking cracks about Muslims and socialists, I thought, no, I mean, his theology is so messed up. But he's a really nice guy, and his daughter's a peach of a gal.
Yeah.
And his wife is also a really nice gal, interested in developing a church garden, and I had contacts with Ellen about agriculture and church and so on and so forth. So, that's all right. Your agenda now. I've done my basic story. You can then.
Well, we were thinking one of two tacks now. One would be to start with you talking a bit more about your agenda and maybe whatever you were thinking about in terms of that. And then our questions are always at the ready.
Okay.
What do you think? Or would you rather?
I can try that. The difficulty with your focus upon discourse systems, which is legitimate, but the difficulty with it, problem with it, is that it covers or hides that to which discourse points. And I think the grammar has to deal, in essence, with what are the phenomena, not how we talk about them, but what are the phenomena that are involved in the curriculum field. And the second level then is how do we talk about them. And I think that distinction has to be made. The other distinction that has to be made is the distinction between education and schooling.
He did his final paper working with your distinction between the two.
Yeah, well, schooling inherently is, and necessarily so, is a political and economic distortion of educational phenomena.
Intrinsically? Or
inherently.
Inherently.
That the
institutions are inherently the enemy of education.
No, not necessarily. Distorting of them, yes, because of the ideological and political and economic forces that bear in on that. Therefore, the curriculum field that starts to think essentially about schooling is automatically thinking of something that is distorted. And to try then to identify what education is out of schooling rather than the reverse is a primary mistake as far as I'm concerned. So so we have the person who is, however you want to talk about it. I want to say being educated, but I don't like that expression. We have the content, and this is why my paper on the demise of the curriculum field, still rings true for me, in which most of my colleagues at the time felt I was messing up, is correct. I still think the central curriculum issue is the content issue. That the other issues that have come into the curriculum field are either organizational issues or economic issues, but it's how we think about what this content stuff is. And the third piece there is then the person or the people who are involved in the educational process, other than the receiver of it, however you want to talk about that. Inherently then in that is what is the relationship between the person who is, I'm going to use the expression being educated, again I have qualms about that, and the content. And it's at this point, it's a case of how we think about that, which is where you're absolutely correct in terms of the discourse systems. And that is exactly where then I bring in my religious or theological orientation and focus of, you're correctly identifying the transcendent, the lure of the transcendent, that the nature of the human being is indeed this constantly being called forth, or however you want to phrase that.
Well, you use the word calling a number of times in there.
Yeah. And by what? Which means, again, in some ways, accepting Parker Palmer's notion of stranger there, that which is strange is inherently educational.
May I ask you, kind of in terms of categories, what distinction do you draw between the stranger, which is it's a kind of personification of otherness, and other places you use the word otherness?
Yeah, I don't care what we use. It's that which is not I.
All right, but it seems rather different to me, because the stranger is an I thou, or potentially so, but otherness, the whole non-discursive realm beyond human reality, that's not necessarily personifiable. Is the only reason I.
Well, you have the distinction between the human element and the non-human element, but nevertheless that which is naturally given, or that which is in nature. But then you also have the human-made environment.
But I'm thinking even beyond nature, beyond our capacity to apprehend.
This brings forth then the discourse systems in terms of who or what do you think a human being is. And that means that, and you are correct in terms of how do we think about that. One of the things that we need to do then, in which I pointed to, and you've also dealt with it, is that the whole psychological description of the human being is inherently limited. How else are we going to think about the human being? What are the historical patterns by which we think about the human being? One of that is indeed that there is something beyond the human being, whether you call it spiritual, what have you, that not everybody would accept that. I think it's crucial in terms of understanding the educational process.
I think you, for me, really definitively defend the use of the spiritual in 85.
Yeah.
It's beautifully done.
Yeah, I don't think, for me there's no question about that. And so perhaps the best way of talking about the educational phenomenon then is not meeting a stranger, but meeting the otherness, that which is not I.
Okay.
And that which is not I then challenges the I to transcend itself, to move beyond.
That over and over.
So you know that.
I even use the word, it's a criticism of me, which I've always found a little puzzling. It does call into question the taken for granted, but it does. But I've always wondered. It's been 30 years ago since you wrote these pieces, but you use the word criticism, that the experience of the stranger invokes a self-criticism.
Yeah.
I've always been curious about that.
Oh, well, yeah, because that which is not I brings me under question.
For me, that's a distinction between under question and criticism.
Well, there I'm Tillichian in the sense that creation is only possible. Continual creation is also only possible because of criticism.
All right.
That the criticism is the Protestant principle is indeed the protest against form.
All right.
And any protest against form then means that I am brought under question by that which is not I. So I must, whatever is not I, protests my present form and raises the possibility of my becoming something else.
Right.
That's the issue. And so part of identifying this historically, then, looking at the curriculum field, is how do educators look at the human being and what are the various discourse systems that are brought to bear on that. And that needs to be traced historically, which we haven't, it may be being done now. But how did learning theory take over with such power as a descriptive or descriptor or descriptive system of the human being? In fact, why did psychological discourse take over? What happened to other discourse systems? And here, you're right on to that.
You were right on. I got it from you.
Well, all right. All right.
That
Yeah.
sketch of the turn of the century.
And then well, that's not, I was going to bring something else up there, but that doesn't quite fit into. No, that's all right. That's one piece. The second piece is indeed, this is how I got into this, incidentally. I was aware before I got into the Heideggerian stuff, and this must have been in my early 60s, maybe as soon as I got to Teachers College, that the major educational problem for me was understanding time. And
Your 67 paper, of course.
right. But that came out of a lot of earlier stuff. In that I started looking at history, I started to read the literature on time.
You make a distinction between temporality and history?
Oh yeah. History is indeed, a conceptualization of temporality.
All right.
And I found a lot of literature on time. And that was before our English guy got involved. What's his name? The guy with the philosopher, physicist who has Lou Gehrig's disease.
Oh, that guy.
Yeah.
Well,
he did
Hawkins.
Yeah, he did, as a major book on time. Well, that wasn't available when I...
Yeah, no.
But I was reading other stuff, which pushed me to Bergson, Henri Bergson,
Right.
a variety of other...
Duration.
Right, the whole problem of duration, which pushed me into the phenomenological stuff. In all of the reading of time, the constant reference I found was Heidegger. You couldn't possibly read something on time without running across being and time. Well, I picked it up, and God, that was too much. And it wasn't until I had a year to really do it that I managed to.
In small bits, I trust.
Yeah.
I don't find it.
Well, I took I took my sabbatical to work on that by myself.
Did you work? Do you mind if I ask in a sustained fashion? I find Heidegger assimilatable only in
Small doses.
40
Small
minutes.
doses.
Yeah.
Well, before, when I first moved to Teachers College and had all these libraries and bookstores nearby, I realized that my major problem was my slow reading. And so I took
That's a gift, it seems to me.
I took a speed reading course,
Well, we all did.
and was doing very well.
It's like Amazon.
Until I picked up Heidegger. And that just totally...
Few speed bumps there.
I totally messed up. But the exciting thing for me in terms of finally getting into Heidegger and being able to use his language was the awareness of how much our language shapes our way we look at the world. And
That's got to be
concept.
one of your major contributions to curriculum studies.
I came out of that, I got into language before I got Heidegger, but Heidegger made me recognize
You see the connection there, even though
right.
it's a
And I'm not a linguist, so those who speak 2 or 3 languages are already aware of that. But
philosophically, Heidegger brought the point off in
yeah.
a definitive way.
So how people deal with temporality, or however you want to talk about it, becomes another one of the grammatical aspects. It's the human being and the human being in time that needs to be articulated. But this is a given, it's a phenomena. It isn't a conceptualization. It is indeed a part of the natural world, part of the nature. How do you think about human beings over time or through time or in time, however you want to talk about that. The other piece then is how do you identify and talk about content? And this is not essentially an epistemological problem, although epistemology is one way of talking about it. So you're now dealing with what are your discourse systems to talk about content, and what kind of content is there? And that also then becomes a total realm of historical explanation or exploration. The difficulty with the way the sciences are taught, for instance, and I deal with this in one of the essays too, is that we essentially deal with it as a knowledge structure rather than recognizing that it is also a referential system for looking at nature. And therefore, when we are dealing with science, in schooling systems, we automatically distort the human being's contact with the natural world and the ways we think about it. And so rather than dealing with what kind of knowledge do we bring in, it's a matter of what kind of environments do we bring in, as well as the language systems that have been developed over time, or symbolic systems that have been developed.
I ask you, what do you mean by environment in that sense?
In that particular use of it right there, I was dealing essentially to the natural environment, nature. However, I recognize that the human-made environment is also something that educates or brings us under criticism.
And that's the usage of it that I'd like to ask you to elaborate if you feel like it, because it's a rather constant, not in an unwelcome way. It's a regular kind of invocation in the early essays about designing an educative environment.
Right.
And so I wanted to hear you talk more about, did you, at some point you talk about school architecture and
I do.
And the corporate
Right, I do.
and so on, but you mean the classroom, I think.
Well, you mean the classroom only if you're in a schooling mentality.
So what do you mean by environment?
Anything that one comes up against.
So
books
would be, the books, for example,
books would be one.
In an environment.
Books are part of the environment.
So does it mean like lived world?
Other people's lived world, yes.
All right.
Not necessarily my lived world, but other people's lived world is indeed part of the environment. So the theories of education or schooling that deal essentially with socialization recognize indeed that social life, the patterns of social life, are something that bring the newcomer under question and ask, should we indeed educate him to be part of that particular environment, that social environment, or are there others? And when we look then at cultural differences, that shows up quite clearly. When we look at different kinds of cultures, that shows up quite differently. But language itself is also an environmental phenomenon. And this comes out most clearly, as far as I'm concerned, and I think it's in Merleau-Ponty, saying that, language isn't just a matter of symbols, it's a matter of another person pounding on your ear physically. And you then, do something with that.
Like
so the presence of other people speaking is an environment that invites you to either pass judgment on it or to pass judgment upon yourself, or to invite you to partake of that particular part of the environment. Okay? And so the way we articulate the environment becomes crucial here, and that also then, what kind of discourse systems are there? Then the other element is the person who is involved with the one who is being educated. What is the role of another person in that process? That is short-circuited, it seems to me, by focusing so much upon teaching, because that inherently begins to distort it, because it begins to think in terms of schooling. But that's not the only way, it seems to me, of looking at it, which is again why I would bring in a religious perspective as a way of getting at that. And this I deal with in the later essays, and I don't remember where. And I would use religious or theological language, drawing very heavily perhaps upon the Rhineland mystics, as well as on Buddhism. That education inherently requires a dying of a part of yourself, or a giving up of a part of yourself to become something else. That is possible only if you are in a relationship of love or in a community that supports you when you are not sure of yourself. And therefore being with somebody who understands that you have to give up a piece of yourself, and while you're giving it up, not have formed anything else, you have to be in a community or in a communal relationship with somebody else who holds you while you die and move on.
Did Virgil Herrick do that for you, or how did you come to that understanding?
I came to that understanding basically through my divorce.
Okay.
When I was going through the divorce, which was a miserable experience, I would get up and I was active in a church in New Haven at that time, which is a good community for us. And my wife had left or was leaving or all kinds of shit. And my kids were still asleep. I would get up at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, go into church. Because I was part of the vestry, I had a key for the church. And sit and read Psalms and cry and probably scream, and one day I looked up and said, the cross is empty, which means that the transformative power of the Spirit and however you want to call it, the healing or the new life. New life is always possible, and the main reason that I was able to sustain myself is that we also had a group in that church at that time, and I would start complaining about what was happening in my life, and some guy who had had a worse marriage situation than mine said, "That's nothing, Dwayne, let me tell you about my life." And I was very much aware of being supported not only by the church, but supported by other people. And that support during this dying of a part of myself made me very much aware of that function, which I think is also expressed in a variety of other literature. I'm not sure I can identify it necessarily, but I know that's not necessarily mine.
And so was that kind of support, would you characterize it as also educational?
Very much. I don't have any, sure. The very fact that the divorce and I had these insights before, but it was really brought home there. The very fact that I was going through a miserable separation meant that a large piece of myself was dying. And yet there was something on the other side of the cross, so to speak, if I can use Christian language there, that said, new life comes out of death. however you want to talk about it. Now, I find the religious language the easiest way to articulate that. I don't think it's the only way, but I think for me, it's the easiest way of articulating it. I don't know how the Jews would talk about it. I do know how the Buddhists would talk about it. They would simply say any kind of hanging on is a form of death. So there's no question about that. But there needs to be a person or there needs to be a community that is available for you when you die, and that hopefully is the same community that will help bring new life to you. And language becomes crucial in that aspect then, in terms of the discourse that goes on and the conversation that goes on. And this then goes way back to my earlier essay on conversation, kind of thing. Now the one who is out, not you, but is with you in the presence of the educational experience, then also brings content to you through both their mannerisms, their behaviors, and their language. And this is inherently then potentially educational for you, which is why identifying role models becomes important, because it indeed indicates possibilities for you. Now, all of those things then come to bear in terms of schooling. And the distortion of all of those show in that. The distortion occurs, first of all, because schooling automatically carries with it some descriptors of who the person is that is learning or is being educated. The school carries with it distortions of the otherness that is available in the classroom. Schooling and the education of teachers distort the community and distort the kind of relationship that you have with somebody who could be a mentor or who could be with you in a loving relationship. Schooling selects the kinds of environments that are going to challenge you or not challenge you, and are going to distort then the depictions of the environments that can be educated. And therefore what we need to look at is the history of the way content is brought into the school, the way the teacher is the carrier of content through their language and through their behavior, and the distortion of community, the interpersonal relationships that are necessary for education.
Do you see a parallel between this distinction between schooling and education and the church?
Oh yeah, the church does the same thing. The church as an institution does the very same thing. The difference there is that if the church is indeed grounded in tradition and grounded in their scriptures, and if the study of scripture and the study of tradition is indeed open and not confined ideologically, such that scriptures are always open to interpretive new possibilities, and the hermeneutical task is not foreclosed, then the scripture is always a possibility for renovation, for renewal, rebirth.
And isn't the same the case with the curriculum?
Well, but what do you mean by curriculum?
Well, I mean scripture curriculum. I mean the same, whatever the content is. Can't the school as an institution offer this same under these conditions?
No, because the content of the schooling is usually selected politically.
Well, so is the sermon.
Oh, the sermon is, but the scriptures aren't.
Yes, but they're made present to the worshipers, if I can use your language.
I agree. In terms of depending upon the sermonizing, yes. But one of the pieces that is missing in the Christian tradition, not necessarily in the Judaic tradition, Judaic tradition, is the fact that the scripture is beyond all interpretation, and therefore it is always historically determined. And the crucial thing then is to get outside of that particular historical tradition and see if it speaks anew to you. And one of the reasons, for instance, that Ellen is doing the thing on African interpretation is that the way the Africans interpret Scripture is quite different than the way the European people do that. And therefore we learn, or we are educated by entering into those interpretive sessions with somebody who reads it differently than you.
I make the same argument in these projects that I did in South Africa, Brazil, Mexico, China.
Yeah, very much so.
Very
much so. Yeah. It's that
the same concepts, but interpreted differently, lived differently, and.
But you want to be careful with the word concept.
Well,
Yeah.
I'm in my domain now, but a concept like Christ, or an experience like Christ. I don't want to disrupt
No, go
your
ahead.
terminological differences here, but the same terms have different resonances in
Very
different
much.
national histories and cultures.
Very much.
Better.
And that's part of the historical task.
And the process of encountering this otherness also can be educational. That's my.
Oh, by all means,
And that's
by all
what
means.
you're saying.
Which is why, one of the things that Ellen participates in, but is also common elsewhere, and one of our friends is engaged in. The Archbishop of Canterbury several years ago recognized that the potential, I'm going to say conflict, but I don't necessarily mean that, but the differences between the Muslims and the Christians required a situation of a joint reading of common scriptures, or of their own scriptures commonly. So one of the things that Ellen has engaged in, as well as other people, are Muslims and Christians and Jews getting together to read their scripture together, their scriptures together, to deal with different interpretations, which is then inherently an educating action on the part of them. Yeah.
Can I jump in for two reasons? One is, can you move your mic up? It's holding against,
Yep.
against your shirt. So-
Yeah.
And then is your aim for distortions to resolve those distortions?
No, it's to recognize the distortions.
And then what's the outcome if we?
Because that's to recognize that schooling is inherent, and Mike does this. He gets sort of stuck in it seems to me, that schooling is inherently a political enterprise,
Right.
and teachers are inherently political actors.
So what's our best hope?
The best hope is to make sure that people are aware of it, and to be aware that they are indeed political actors. Is it what they choose, or is it not what they choose? And therefore, what's the stuff that's been talked? The focus of teachers resisting kind of thing is part of that. I think it's narrow in some way, but I think it's a necessary insight. That's my trouble with Mike. He got stuck in the political aspects of the work and didn't move beyond it. And hasn't dealt with the metaphysical or the ontological.
Or ethical, which you.
No, and ethical, I would agree with you, yeah. Oh, well, I'm not sure, he does a little bit with the ethical, but not in any strong way. He is so ideologically oriented there that has become his distortion in some ways. When I talk to him about you, we'll deal with that ideological piece too.